That's good.
Do you feel comfortable?
I feel great.
Okay, and there's a volume button. We'll test if it's okay for you.
Okay. Okay. Tony, I got you. How you doing?
I was like, oh, I guess we're not doing that.
Okay.
I'm behind you again. Yeah.
So,
No, I can't remember which glasses.
Try a little bit more.
This.
Tony, say something to me. Sing me happy birthday. I'm doing so good, Tony. It's great to hear you. Perfect. Thank you. Okay.
I'm Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media.
And I'm Brad Smith, president of Microsoft. We've teamed up to bring you a new content partnership called Global Stage.
We're hosting critical conversations about the biggest challenges the world is facing right now at the intersection of technology, politics, and society.
You'll hear from public and private sector leaders and innovators
On topics like cybersecurity, climate change, and recovering from the pandemic.
Join us for live streams, podcasts, and more throughout the year.
Hello, welcome to a special GZERO Media live stream. I'm Nicholas Thompson, CEO of The Atlantic. This program is part of the award-winning Global Stage series, produced in partnership between GZERO and Microsoft. We're coming to you today from Davos, Switzerland, home of the 2022 World Economic Forum. This gathering of global leaders from both public and private spheres is happening at a critical moment for the world as major crises converge, from pandemic to the war in Ukraine, ongoing threats like climate change, rapid digital transformation, and all that comes with it. I'm joined by an amazing all-star panel. Ian Bremmer is the founder and president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and my own college professor. Brad Smith is president and vice chair of Microsoft, and Helle Thorning-Schmidt served as the 46th Prime Minister of Denmark from 2011 to 2015. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
All right, let's get cracking. Ian, we're in Davos. We haven't been in Davos in a long time.
Yeah.
What are you excited to learn about this time? What is going to be the big theme? And what are we going to get through?
This is the single Davos that's been most driven by geopolitics that I've ever attended. It is a crisis-rich environment. Ukraine is the particular issue. President Zelensky just beamed in with his virtual speech. First time I've seen a virtual speech in Davos that literally got a standing ovation, except for the Chinese delegation that was attending, and that's kind of interesting. There are, of course, no Russians here, no businesses, no delegates, no government officials. This is supposed to be the World Economic Forum, and yet there is an enormous concern that not only is globalization unwinding a bit, but also that the Russians, a G20 country, first time you've ever forcibly decoupled a G20 economy from the world, or from at least the advanced industrial democracies, which are sort of dominating the stage here. So from that perspective, it's a bit of a discomforting Davos. It's not the kind of topics that most of the people that come up in the mountain are usually talking about.
Is this the first time you've ever had to analyze who was standing at the end of a speech to determine what was going on?
Oh, I think a little bit, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the addresses in the United States.
Old Kremlinology as well.
Helle, what are you looking for?
Well, I think it is dramatic Davos. I've been to many Davos, but this is so dramatic. And I feel that business leaders are truly realizing that they understood that they had to do something about climate. They understand that they have to do diversity. They understand they have to have values. But now they're understanding that they also have to engage in geopolitics. They cannot escape it. They're actually in front of politicians when we talk about these things. And I think this is so dramatic. So I have not experienced something so dramatic as this. And I think we will leave here thinking, is the world coming completely apart? Because that is what it feels like when you are here. And as Ian is saying, the Russians are not here. The Chinese are a little bit here. So it feels like things are coming apart, and it feels like geopolitics is here to stay, and business leaders really have to be there and understand how they behave in a world that is so different from what they're used to.
But does the whole world feel like it's coming apart, or just Russia and China? Because it seemed like there are a lot of people who are coming together. I mean, everybody, except for the Chinese, was standing for Zelensky.
Well, I think that everyone thinks that things are coming apart. And that's not only because what's happening in Ukraine, it's also what's happening in the global economic mood. People are getting depressed about what's happening. We will see, because of hunger issue, or because of supply issues, we will actually see hunger in a scale that we haven't seen for a long time. So that is depressing. Just when we talk about that, we will see countries keeping their own goods to themselves. We're still seeing supply chain issues. And then, of course, we're talking about Europe going into recession. So I think, no, it's not only Ukraine. So it's big deal what we're talking about here. Yeah. And it's hard not to feel it when you're here.
Brad, Helle talked about business leaders being interested in geopolitics. You're like the most geopolitically interested business leader I've talked to in Davos. You, in fact, host business lunches on geopolitics every year. Do you feel like you have more company as Helle right now?
I think we do, but it doesn't mean that people are necessarily excited to come to the party.
No, they're not.
Every year at Davos, I think one of the questions people ask is, what's the conversation about this year? And I think you've heard two really valuable perspectives. I think increasingly it is about, in effect, what are the second order and third order effects of the war in Ukraine as we meet this week the third month and the start of the fourth month. And you are seeing people ask, what does it mean for food? First, food prices, ultimately food availability. What does it mean for energy? Energy prices, energy sources, especially if you think about what it means to have a long war rather than a short war. And all of this comes as a series of crises, hence Ian's recent book. But we've gone from literally the plague, a pandemic, to political turmoil, to long-term concerns about climate, now a war. And business leaders are having to navigate just an extraordinary array of challenges, some economic, business as usual maybe, but many geopolitical.
Well, if there was ever a sentence that I feel like would inspire Ian Bremmer and just get him excited, it would be the second and third order consequences of the war in Ukraine. So I feel like I can't let that go by. Ian, what are the second and third order consequences of the war in Ukraine?
Well, look, the interesting thing is that back in 2009, which I think was either my first or my second Davos, there was a massive sense of crisis, but everyone attending kind of felt like they understood the playbook, the fiscal and monetary tools that you use to respond to it. This time around, people are asking, we know that there's this massive crisis. People don't know what the second and third order consequences are. So one example, people are mostly thinking about this as a war inside Ukraine. But it's not a war in Ukraine. It's actually a war between Russia and NATO. I mean, Russia was engaged in cyber attacks against the United States through, criminal organizations and the rest a year ago, and Biden told them to cut it off. They stopped doing it largely. Are they going to start doing it again when NATO has really doing everything they can to dramatically degrade Russia's capabilities? What about disinformation? What about espionage? Well, what happens when Finland and Sweden in relatively short order join NATO? So one second order consequence is the fact that NATO and Russia are going to be in some level of not just Cold War, but have some aspects of hot war. We're not ready for that. The second order consequence, which is massive, is that so many people have said, Ukraine, you care more about Ukraine than you do Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, because they're European, they're white people, you accept them into your homes, that kind of thing. It's not just that. There's some of that, don't get me wrong. But the reality is this crisis matters so much more because of the knock-on effects for global commodity prices, for energy, for fertilizer, for food. For decades, you had global middle classes increasing and you had advanced poverty reducing. And now you actually see that turning around. On the back of the pandemic, so many countries around the world that have paid no attention to this crisis said, no, this is America's problem. This is Europe's problem. We're not going to pay attention. But they're going to have to because they're going to starve. And the impact on their governments is going to be dramatic. So I think we can already see two second order consequences that are direct and near term that are earth-changing.
So let's go to Zelensky's talk this morning. So Zelensky this morning says, hey, give us all the weapons, maximize the sanctions, take all the yachts, go get them. And Europe has basically been completely behind that. But is there a point where Europe's going to say, oh, wait a second, as Ukraine sort of pushes a little bit into Russia, as Ukraine starts to have a little more success, when does Europe say, okay, enough's enough?
Well, there's still things that Europe can do. Don't forget that in Europe, we import a lot of oil still from Russia and gas as well. So we're putting a lot of dollars into Russia every day to finance their war effort, basically. So there's still things that Europe can do, but what people are worried about in the capitals of Europe right now is, of course, recession. And they're seriously worried about that because of the structure of our energy supply. So this is an issue that we're discussing. There's also the discussion that goes on, which is why has Russia not come in more forceful than they have in Ukraine? Everyone loves the tale that it's because they don't have the capacity and all those things. And that might be true, but they are better than they're showing now in cyber attacks, for example. And I think the whole intelligence community are debating why have they not done that? So what people are maybe thinking is that they're not stepping up because that will take things to a next level. And don't forget, as Ian is saying, there are many unintended consequences of this. And one of them is that for the first time, Europe is actually speaking with one voice. They used to divide and rule between European nations. They can't do that anymore. Even countries that used to be with the Russians, they have to be with the other European nations, and I think that's something that Russia had not understood would happen. And then, of course, the application for NATO membership from Sweden and Finland, which is a very big deal.
So
I mean, Russia is basically getting 1,400 new kilometer border to NATO if those two countries join. They cannot have anticipated that.
So, Brad, tell me the most interesting second-order consequences of the conflict for Microsoft. Like, clearly, conflict happens. I assume you pulled your engineers out of Russia. Maybe you took your servers off of maybe servers on Russia's coast. I don't know how. What did you do first, and what are you going to do second?
Well, I think the thing that we've done first is, frankly, to support and defend Ukraine.
Yeah.
The first thing we had to do was help the Ukrainian government move into the cloud. Before this war began, the Ukrainian government ran entirely on its own digital infrastructure, on its own servers, in its own government buildings. And people recognized something that, frankly, was always there, but no one was talking about. If your servers are in government buildings, they can be destroyed by cruise missiles. So wait,
are you serious? At the start of the war, all their servers were in a building?
Up until the war began, not just one building, but in government buildings until shortly before. But we've literally worked with the Ukrainian government to move 16 of the 17 Ukrainian ministries into the cloud, into our cloud and data centers across Europe. So the first thing that it causes one to reflect upon is sort of, frankly, a classic military development. You've got to disperse your defensive assets so they're not vulnerable to a single attack. And in the world today, governments run on digital technology. They have to be able to sustain them. And the best and perhaps only way to do that is to disperse government technology assets into the public cloud and into data centers. The second thing we've had to do is frankly defend Ukraine against cyber attacks. I think that there's a misunderstanding oftentimes when people say, oh, the Russians haven't really brought their A-team to the cyber war. They absolutely have. They've just concentrated all of their assets on Ukraine itself. So they haven't engaged in cyber attacks on, say, the rest of Europe or on other NATO countries. I think there's a misunderstanding. People think the war began on February the 24th. No, it began on February the 23rd. That's when we saw 300 Russian coordinated cyber attacks all seek to take down the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian banks. And the striking thing about cyberspace is it doesn't know the same territorial borders of land or sea or the air. So where were the first cyber attacks seen? They weren't in Ukraine. We saw them in Seattle, Washington, in our data centers because we were working with the Ukrainian government. And then the last thing I will say is, so far in this war, defense has proven to be stronger in offense, frankly, in almost every category, but especially when it comes to cyberspace. And it's, I think, a real testament to the amount of innovation in cybersecurity protection, collaboration over the last 5 years, really since the NotPetya attack on Ukraine. So I'm not sure that those are second-order effects. We're still all in first-order effects. But the nature of war itself has changed.
This is fascinating. In fact, it's a perfect moment to bring in a poll conducted by GZERO. So it's a poll conducted of viewers and followers in social media. First question is about technology and specifically the risks it poses. Which of these cyber threats worries you most? Choices were malware, disinformation, misuse of AI, cyber warfare. Here's how people answered. 42% said disinformation was their biggest concern.
Interesting.
Followed by cyber warfare, misuse of AI, and malware. When you filled out this poll, Brad, what did you put in?
Well, I would say disinformation as well. But the other thing that I would say is that it's often easy when you're inside an organization or in a field to look at things like that and say, these are 4 different things. Which one do I think about the most? When we really analyze activity in this war, from a Russian perspective, these are all connected. The disinformation attacks, and they are attacks, these are really propaganda attacks, are coordinated with other cyber attacks. And they're designed to reinforce each other, and they will be, I think, for as long as this war continues.
Wow. All right. Ian, do you want to answer the poll question? Malware, disinformation, misuse of AI, or cyber warfare? What did you check when you tweeted that poll?
Look, I mean, time frame matters. I'd probably say misuse of AI is the thing that worries me in the most existential way. But the reason I'm not surprised that disinformation is what people responded with is because disinformation is what people engage with on a daily basis. They feel it, they see it, it makes them anxious, it unnerves them, and they have no idea how to respond to it. And I think for cyber, like, we know how much cyber costs and we know how dangerous it is, but it's not something that individuals are thinking about in the same personal way as they are experiencing disinformation.
How would you answer?
I'm also there. That's what I would say. But that's also just as a citizen that you are worried about what you know and what you don't know. And I think people have seen real examples where they believe something that turns out not to be true, or where they're seeing, for example, in the States where Europeans look at and say, we don't want to go there, when people storm Congress based on false information. So I think people are really feeling that is a big issue for all of us and our democracies and our values and everything we stand for.
So, Brad, you said something fascinating about cybersecurity, which is that defense is now better than offense, right? And up and down, and sounds actually reasonable. The data from Ukraine does suggest that defense is better than offense. Is that true of disinformation right now?
No.
No, and why not?
I would say, first of all, our ability to defend against any cyber threat always relies first on our ability to detect it. And I think over the past 5 years, we've made enormous advances in our ability to detect cyber attacks, cyber threats, oftentimes even the pre-positioning of cyber weapons. And I don't think that we're nearly as far right now in the ability to detect disinformation attacks from abroad. I think we're on a path to start to develop that capability, but we're just 3 years behind. The second thing is that...
Wait, the good guys are 3 years behind the bad guys? Or what do you mean 3 years behind?
I think we're 3 years behind where we are with respect to other forms of cyber attacks.
Okay.
So, and I think we now have a clear vision of what we can bring together to better detect, call it foreign propaganda or disinformation attacks. But we have a lot of work to do, and we will. We'll move, I think, very quickly. But I also think that we have an additional challenge when it comes to disinformation. And it was brought to light very clearly in Washington, D.C. over the last few weeks. There's a real limit on the ability of democratically elected governments to play a role in pronouncing what is true and what is false. And so I think almost inherently, the work to really detect and combat foreign propaganda attacks is going to require a different set of roles. Roles by the private sector, roles by NGOs, roles by academics, and roles by government. But I think the government role by definition is going to have to be somewhat more narrowly defined in order for the public to accept it.
God willing. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Helle, why has Europe not been so wrecked and racked by disinformation?
I think we are, but I think...
I mean, you got plenty of it. It's not that you're free of it.
No, but I think we are. But I do think that the democratic debate in Europe is less hostile and less fragmented as what you see in the US. I mean, I think that's something that Ian has been writing about for years, that you see the fragmentation and the loss of the vacancy of the middle. There is no middle anymore in the US debate. And I think that is making it prone to disinformation. And at least we have much more middle ground in the European debate about almost everything. And that goes for the individual European countries, but it also goes for our European Union. You have that middle ground. You have conservative, liberal leaders, but everyone seeks the middle ground. And I think that's a huge difference from Europe and the US right now.
You can't solve a problem unless you agree on what the problem is. I mean, if two parents have an issue with the kids, and they both think it's a completely different issue, it's very unlikely they're going to resolve it. The Europeans have a generally better sense of what they consider to be disinformation, just like they do on, say, hate speech. The Americans do not. And so, I mean, the issue is fundamentally politicized, and therefore resolving it for one part of the political spectrum in the US literally means making it worse for the other. And that makes it almost unresolvable, even if you get to the point that you do a much better job of identifying, as Brad suggested.
And that's the environment where disinformation thrives. I mean, it really feeds off that. So I think that is where it all starts. And we're just not there, and hopefully won't get there in Europe right now.
But I think there's two other things that you two are noting that are powerful. One is one of the differences between the United States and much of continental Europe is that the U.S. has a two-party system, not by order of the Constitution. It's just that it's how politics evolved. In a two-party system, politics is a zero-sum game. One party's gain is the other party's loss. more European countries have a multi-party system. So it forces people always to build relationships with people in other parties. The other thing, Ian, is something that you said that I think is analytically a helpful tool for almost everything. And it's called, let's spend more time talking about problems instead of just rushing to debate solutions. Can we add more data? Can we inform conversations? Can we use data analytics? Can we use technology to just start to agree on the problem and then start to solve it? I think it might help us unlock some of these challenges.
It's a very good point.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I mean, the joy of coalitions is really a big thing. Everyone was always criticizing Angela Merkel for being indecisive and, prolonging all discussions. It was because she was used to coalitions. I mean, I ran a three-party coalition that didn't even have a majority. Every day you wake up and you don't have a majority for your policy. And I think that gives you humility. You have to listen to others. You have to have the dialogue. And I really hope we don't lose that in Europe, because you're absolutely right. That has become what we do all the time in European governments.
Something Biden's going to look forward to next year.
Yes, and Lord knows America will work better then. Well, that is a beautiful segue into our second poll. So GZERO asked, who should lead cybersecurity efforts globally? The choices were technology companies, governments, both together.
That's a good one.
The answers, technology companies, 9%.
Yeah.
Man, but Brad, you get slapped there. Governments, 15%. I don't know,
Both
not so good, Helle,
together,
either. Both together,
Yeah.
coalitions, beautiful, 76%. Would any of you guys have voted differently than both together? Sounds like both together is kind of what you guys have been arguing for.
There's no real alternative, I would say, certainly to the cyber attacks that you see in the world today. I do think that if we were talking about who can defend against naval attacks or attacks by air and cruise missiles, you'd say the government. And I think what both together, it's interesting because it shows me that people do understand the nature of cyberspace. It defies traditional borders. Much of it is owned by private sector companies. They operate data centers and cables and the like. But if you leave it to tech companies alone, that's not a good path. We really need both together.
But Helle, let me ask you this. European governments are not traditionally so supportive of tech companies, if I've been following the regulatory debate for quite a while. In fact, they tend to take the tech executives and drop bricks on their heads. Is that going to make this kind of partnership harder?
I'm not sure I agree with the drop bricks on their heads. I mean, they believe. I mean, Europeans believe much more in regulation than the US does, and that's why, for me, it's natural that the first Digital Services Act that we have, a real big regulation of tech, comes from Europe. They've been talking about this for a long time. I know the rhetoric can sometimes be a bit harsh, but when you speak to decision makers about this, I don't think it's that bad. They just like regulation more than the Americans do, and that's why it comes from Europe. And I do think that everyone understands that we cannot solve this we've got the government capacity on its own. In Europe, for example, we also know that, of course, we need to work together in the EU. We need to work together in NATO to do that. And both organizations have actually stepped up what they're going to do about cyber attacks. But no one thinks we can do it without the tech sector. How would you actually do that? And I think Brad's example from Ukraine, I didn't know all the stuff you have been doing, but I think it's really important that people actually get access to that knowledge so they can see how you can help solve a really big security issue.
Ian, will you explain what your World Data Organization idea is?
Well, sure,
Since
I will.
It ties in nicely.
But I'll take half a step back, which is that I think
take three-quarters of a step back.
Going with what Brad and I were strongly agreeing about a little bit ago, which is that you need to spend more time defining the problem before you can resolve it. And we haven't done that here. I would start with a intergovernmental panel on artificial intelligence or on disruptive technologies or on cyber. Because one of the reasons why, even though the Americans and the Chinese don't agree and trust each other, anything you do on climate is largely moving in the same direction. And the reason for that is because you have a group, a global group, that is seen as responsible and authoritative, that has gotten together and defined the climate problem. So you no longer have significant disinformation that really undermines that. You need to do that on cyber. You need to do that in artificial intelligence. So you start with an intergovernmental panel on artificial intelligence that the UN could run, but could be multi-stakeholder. It could be private sector and public sector. Why? Because we've all just said there's no way you resolve this without the tech companies and the governments working together. Once you have that, then you have the seeds for global architecture, for a world data organization that would, open chapters, allow companies and countries to come in and determine how one thinks about releasing an algorithm into the wild, how you test it before you unleash it on our children, for example, just as you would with a vaccine or just as you would with a GMO, how you think about disruptive technologies that a small club of countries or companies may be considered, may be deemed to be responsible with, but you wouldn't want every country in the world or every rogue organization to have. We've done that in the past with the nuclear club and nuclear non-proliferation. And over 80 years, we've done a reasonable job. There's nothing remotely like that when we talk about the cyberspace that we've been discussing just now.
Well, that is a lovely segue into our next section. Helle, I'm going to release you from this panel. Thank you for all of your wonderful contributions. Thank you for being here. So thank you very much. Ian, I'm going to ask you a question, and then we're going to move into part 3. Will you explain your Goldilocks theory of crises?
Sure. Simple idea, which is that when you have an environment where institutions aren't working very well and they're eroding over time, and you know that they're eroding because the world's power structures are moving away from how the institutions are supposed to function, whether it's NATO or the WTO or the Security Council, what happens over time is those institutions become delegitimized. And the only way you're going to fix them is in response to crisis. Because you can't really anticipate a crisis if your institution doesn't work very well, but you can respond to it. But not all crises are of such scale that you can respond to them. If they're a really small crisis that affect people or countries that you don't care enough about, then you're not going to change the way you behave. If it's a massive crisis that you legitimately don't have tools to fix, even though you want to, then you're going to call up in a ball in the corner and it's all over. So you need a Goldilocks crisis. The funny thing is Putin didn't realize that what he was giving the West by invading Ukraine was a Goldilocks crisis. Climate change today, in my view, reflects a Goldilocks crisis.
So if Putin had done something more or something less, it would have been much harder to respond to.
What I thought Putin was going to do, he claimed that, falsely, that the Ukrainians were committing acts of genocide against Russians on the ground in the Donbass, in the southeast territory of Ukraine that the Russians had already informally occupied. And he didn't have enough troops to take over all of Ukraine, but he had enough to take the Donbass, what he's presently trying to do. I think it's quite clear that if he had just done that and not gone into Kiev and not sent 190,000 troops in to try to remove Zelensky or kill him, that the international response would have been vastly weaker, would have been much more divided. He wouldn't have been an international
He could have gotten to Kiev eventually.
Maybe, but the point is that he could have much more likely he would have gotten away with it the way he got away with Crimea and Southeast Ukraine in 2014, the way he got away with Georgia in 2008.
All right, well, on that note, let's talk about some of the other problems in the world. I'd like to bring in Elizabeth Cousens, President and CEO of the United Nations Foundation. Welcome. Lovely to have you here in our lively conversation. So, tell me about what you're worried about.
Well, it's a really long list. So, I think everybody this week and in general has been talking about the compounding crisis that we face in the world. So it's COVID, it's climate, it's conflict. We're seeing now a milestone reached in forced displacement. I don't think any of us thought we would be here. 100 million people now forcibly displaced in the world. COVID efforts have slowed, even though it doesn't cease from being a challenge. Climate obviously is everywhere around us. The latest Ipcc reports, Ian, you were just talking about the need for intergovernmental panels. Well, the latest reports from the Ipcc are devastating. They say there's still a window, but the window is getting much smaller. And we have what I would call kind of accelerating crises, which I have to say are accelerants of crises, which worry me almost more than the crises themselves. And one of those is just corrosive levels of inequality across societies, between societies. And the other is this question of a toxic media environment that just makes polarization so much greater in so many of our societies. So all of those make what we most need, international cooperation, that much harder. So, Ian, I actually really hope you're right about the Goldilocks crises, because I think we do need something to jump us out of our skins, to get serious about the solutions we know we need to take, to not make short-sighted moves that actually make that all the harder, and really find ways to reinvent and renew, cooperative effort where we most can, even if those spaces are hard to find.
Brad, what is the crises that you think that the world has come up with the best response to? When you look at a crisis and you say, you know what, you did a pretty good job there.
Well, I'd probably look back at the Cold War. In a couple of ways. I mean, first of all, I think we tend to use the word crisis to define a short-term problem. And the truth is, unfortunately, some problems require long-term sustained efforts. And the Cold War is a testament to the unity of many countries from basically 1945 to 1990. So that's an extraordinarily long period of time. I think it was a transatlantic partnership. It was a commitment by countries to stick to common values, to never go so far as to precipitate a hot war, but to remain united for as long as it took to see certain values prevail. And I think we should draw a certain inspiration as we look to something like climate. That's at least a 30, if not 40-year challenge that we're going to have to address. I'm certainly not going to predict that the war in Ukraine is going to last that long, but it's been 3 months and it has no end in sight yet. I do think the other thing that the Cold War should remind us of is tools evolve over time. And to some degree, you have to make yourself available to use the tools that emerge, constantly innovating. And of course, as a tech company, that's what we see. We see the power of data, we see the power of digital technology, and we see the ability to use these to address each crisis as it unfolds.
Well, Ian and I are both very happy about the Cold War because late Russian war plans revealed that if they were to do a test atomic attack, it wouldn't have been aimed at Washington or New York because those cities are too important. It would have been aimed at Boston, where we both grew up. So very happy about global cooperation there. On that lovely note, let's move to the next GZERO poll. This is poll number 3. And the question was, I believe this moment of crisis will lead to greater global cooperation, more nationalism, retreat from cooperation, or no significant change. I would have had a hard time predicting exactly where this one would come out. And GZERO's followers say more nationalism. 49%, greater global cooperation, 35%, no significant change, 16%. Ian, does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me. It bums me out a bit, right? I mean,
It's your followers.
Yeah. I mean, but also, look, no significant change. We've gotten beyond the point of sort of ennui and indifference. And I think that is itself important. And I think a lot of people recognize that whether you're looking at the United States domestically and what's happened after the events of January 6th, or whether you're looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or whether you're looking at the US-China relationship, or COVID, or climate, that too much has been set in motion to say we can forget about it, we can go on and keep on getting on. That itself is important. But the fact that a lot of people out there feel like they do not have the tools, are not empowered to make a difference, they've lost so much trust for all of their elites. And look, we're in the middle of this right now. It's media, and it's corporates, and it's bankers, and it's their governing officials. And that's why you have such a greater sense of instability today, because people just don't trust the folks that are supposed to be showing them the way. So no, I guess I can't say I'm surprised, but I am a little bit heartened that you don't have 50% saying, nah, it's not going to make a difference, because that's what they would have said 10 or 20 years ago, and that kind of got us to this place.
Elizabeth, let's talk about this in the context of food security. So we've had these crises. We've had crisis in Ukraine. We've just gotten through COVID. How will that change the way we're going to deal with coming food crises?
Well, first it's worth saying something about the scale of the food crisis. So we were already in terrible shape because of the pandemic and a whole bunch of preceding dynamics, climate-related, top of the list. By the end of last year, we were at over 140 million food insecure. We're now at 276 by UN estimates. So that's just an extraordinary number of people in very dire circumstances. Nearly 50 million of those are on the brink of famine. Not yet there, but on the brink. So this is a catastrophic humanitarian crisis that we're facing around the world. The UN is trying to do what it can to convene any number of actors, leading institutions, private sector, and others to try to think about ways to respond to it. And there needs to be a much more ambitious humanitarian response. But we have to look at the underlying fundamentals of this crisis as well, beyond the most immediate and acute needs, how we address food security writ large. So that requires the kind of cooperation we're talking about, because it's food systems, it's climate systems, it's economic systems, it's dealing with things like, export controls. It's a very tempting thing to want to, fall back within your own borders and preserve, but it's the worst possible thing you could do at a moment like this. So exactly that political and social capital that's really needed to try to encourage the right sort of cooperative solutions is, of course, the thing that's very much at risk. And I would just say, Ian, I don't think your followers, they don't want the nationalist responses. They just anticipate it. So I think what they're saying is that they are listening to you and they see what's at stake. And that's, I hope, what we're all taking out of this moment.
I will say, I think some of them do want the nationalist response because they believe that the elites themselves are so far from what they need to do that they are prepared to argue to have things get broken.
Yeah, and that's fair. That's a fair frustration to understand, even if the solutions may not be the right remedy. Yep.
But do you think we're going to be able to cooperate, as these 50 million people are on the brink of starvation, as news reports start to come out? Do you think the world will come together and try to solve this problem?
Well, I think it's what hangs in the balance. Look, there are, and you see dynamics on both sides. So it is, I will say, disappointing that the world's wealthiest nations have not seen fit to do more than fund 8% of the UN's combined humanitarian appeals. The UN humanitarian appeal for the Horn of Africa is 2% funded, 93 million against a need of 4.5 billion. That's just not acceptable, and it actually is remediable, even with compression on different budgets. So I think there's every opportunity to show leadership around these kinds of crises. And I do think it's correct that governments recognize this in a variety of ways, but that it really is more important to fortify some of the cooperative infrastructure that we have in the world in order to deal not just with today's problems, but tomorrow. And, Brad, I'm glad you raised the Cold War as an illustration, because even at the worst moments of the Cold War, we solved smallpox. So it is possible to cooperate even under the most divisive and contested of conditions, and I think we're going to have to look a little bit back at that era for some lessons for how to do that.
Brad, does Microsoft and the big tech companies have a role in food insecurity, or is that just sort of out of your domain?
I think that we have a role to support the various agencies in the United Nations and others. I'd say first and foremost to use the power of data to make sure that we're assisting with forecasting.
Mm-hmm. Forecasting where there'll be a need.
Yeah, where are there likely to be shortages? Where might there be a surplus? Where are there opportunities to move food from one place to another? And I think the World Food Program has very strong forecasting capabilities. But if you just think back to COVID, just think about how much of a role data played. Even like every morning you get up and you read about, you still do, the rate of cases, the rate of hospitalization, the power of data to help manage this. So I think that's the first thing that we need to do. It's the first thing that we're at Microsoft using data to help the United Nations do. I think beyond that, it does go back to so many things that go well beyond digital technology that are going to require collaboration about logistics and the like. Some of which will depend on digital technology, but some of the more profound questions, frankly, go to, an awful lot of the world's food comes from two countries that are currently at war. Does anyone think, do either of them think, does the rest of the world think that there should be an opportunity to have a limited war that opens a port so that food can leave to feed the world? That's the kind of question that we'll probably find ourselves talking about 60, 120 days from now, but are not yet.
I was interested when Zelensky talked about the Russians stealing their food supplies every day. Ian, you want to jump in here?
Well, I just wanted to say that there's very little that you can say happening on the ground between Russia and Ukraine that gives room for near-term optimism. But the negotiations on Mariupol and getting the civilians out with the UN and the International Committee for the Red Cross, 700 plus civilians, they got out there alive today because of diplomacy that involved the Russians and the Ukrainians. Not easy to do. The other place that I'm not optimistic yet, but it's moving, involves the UN, involves Turkey, involves the United States, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians. And it is, can we get the mines out of the Black Sea, Ukrainian and Russians? Can we get the Turks to actually have their ships in the Black Sea, providing safe passage, and so that we can get the food out? Yeah. And they're working the issue hard. No guarantees, but my God, I want diplomacy to press as hard as humanly possible on that issue. But it will be a meaningful difference for tens of millions of people if we're able to resolve that in the coming months.
Wonderful. Easily, half of the World Food Programme's food supplies come from Ukraine. So so getting that port open is absolutely essential, of its wheat.
Wow. All right, well, we're almost out of time, so why don't we go around and everybody say one thing that they're optimistic about. So, Elizabeth, you want to start us off?
Well, I have a long list there too, but if I have to pick one, and some of it's the leadership of companies like Brad's, but I would focus on young people. I know that's a common thing one says, but we do a lot of work at the UN Foundation with young people in a variety of forms, and I see so much determination, so much strategy, so much seriousness of purpose about, frankly, trying to do a better job than we all did. So any kind of work that puts an engine under that drive, to me, is really a source for hope and for just seriousness of purpose. So that's my answer.
It's probably not a surprise that I'll say a certain optimism about the power of innovation. You know, and in part it's the technology that we work with, but it's really the technology that everyone works with. Take climate. You know, when you look at advances in wind and solar, think about fusion and green hydrogen. When you think about long duration battery storage, when you think about sustainable aviation fuel, when you think about direct air capture, yeah, these are all things that in 2022 look like they're somewhere between they're here to we hope someday they'll be here. But by the year 2050, I think we'll look back and we'll say that is fundamentally what helped us do what we needed to do to preserve the habitability of the planet. And so, you know, I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the power of this next generation to build on the people who've come before and keep helping us innovate our way in part out of these problems.
Wonderful. Ian?
I'm going to say Europe. You know, Europe stronger as an entity than it went in, both because they took on vaccine acquisition and distribution at an EU-wide level. It took them a while, but they actually brought Europe together. And most importantly, redistribution of wealth from wealthy European countries to poorer European countries. It's something that they wouldn't have conceived of doing during the global financial crisis or 2009, 2010 with the Eurozone crisis. I also see Europe coming together more strongly in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. True. Not just NATO, but the EU. So the fact that we've had two crises right in rapid succession and the strongest, most functional supranational institution of governance in the world actually comes out looking a little bit more functional. I think that's pretty good news.
That's very good news. All right, that's it. That does it for us today. I want to thank Ian Bremmer, Brad Smith, Elizabeth Cousens. Thank you so much for being here. You can follow GZERO's coverage of the World Economic Forum and all the issues we discussed today by heading to gzeromedia.com. I'm Nicholas Thompson. Thank you for watching. Have a great week.